Asian Americans have been disproportionately discriminated against in America for decades, but with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the discrimination and violence has grown tremendously. I'm Danielle Kosick, and I spoke to the CEO of Treehouse, Dr. Lisa Chin, about the difficulties Asian Americans have been facing since the beginning of the pandemic. Dr. Chin, thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you, Danielle.
First off, let's start with, how have you seen Asian Americans been discriminated against in America before the pandemic? So in modern times, but before the pandemic.
Danielle, there's a long history of discrimination against Asian Americans that starts with the very first times they came here. So there's a number of different incidences we can point to, but most recently, I think it depends how far you want to go back and how far how much you, I don't want this to turn into a history lesson, but there's definitely a lot to talk about. I mean, we can start with, if we begin at the beginning, back in 1882, there was something called the Chinese Exclusion Act that specifically prevented Chinese from settling here in the United States and from owning property. And the reason for that was because originally laborers came from China to do the work on the railroads and in Hawaii to work in the fields. And at the time, there was so much immigration from this cheap labor source that Americans in power became alarmed and therefore put up a series of anti-immigration acts that forbid Chinese from really putting roots here. And there were also other acts that prevented Chinese women specifically from coming over. The last of these exclusionary acts, the Magnuson Act, was not repealed until 1964. So that tells you a little bit about the legacy, especially in immigration laws that are against Asian Americans. There's other incidents as well. In 1982, there was a man named Vincent Chin who was beaten to death by some auto workers in Detroit. This was at the time when Japanese imported cars were starting to eclipse the sale of domestic cars. And Vincent was mistaken for a Japanese American and he was beat to death in the street. So these attacks are not, the current attacks that we're seeing are not without historical precedent and represent a whole history of viewing Asian Americans as others. So we could talk more about anti-Japanese sentiment with the orders against them. I mean, there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, and absolutely. Have you, again, before the pandemic, what have you seen like in modern times, I guess? So maybe just the year leading up to the pandemic or the few years before then, what kind of discriminations were you seeing?
Oh gosh, okay. So I think every time that there is a recession or that there's issues around trade, there's always a desire, and there's always something in the press that talks about either the communist threat from China or back in the day when there was SARS, that was the Asian avian flu. There's been a lot of different incidences where anytime there's something that has an economic impact, people want to find a villain. And if it's not the former USSR or Russia, it's usually China, especially because we're seeing that there's a lot more economic power that's happening in that country. We're seeing that there's a lot more global immigration from Asia in general. And when that happens in the United States, people look for reasons and will point to people who don't look like them. And because there's been, in recent times, in the past 10 years, there's been more of an influx of wealthy, educated Asians as opposed to the turn of the century when it was Asians as laborers coming from different regions. When you see the rise in immigration of Chinese and of Asian Indians who are educated and wealthy in their own countries, it's very threatening to people because many people come here on H-1B visas and come here to do very high level intellectual work. And there's always a sense of pushback that these people, they're not here, they're foreigners or something different, they're someone different, and they don't belong here. They're hurting American lives. So I've seen quite a bit of that. There's also a long history of Asian women being seen as either the sort of stereotype evil sorceress and temptress, or the subservient maid kind of ama person who's just going to be your servant and take care of your children. Those stereotypes are borne out in pretty much every, all the cinematic history. If you look at the world of Susie Wong and you look at movies from a long time ago, like Flower Drum Song, and it wasn't until Amy Tan wrote The Joy Luck Club that stories that were more rooted in reality and less in highly sexualized or highly villainized stereotypes. It wasn't until Amy Tan that we started to see Asians portrayed as humans with their own stories and their own families and their own issues. So those things have not gone away. And with the previous president, with our 45th president of the United States, they were kind of exacerbated because it helps the rhetoric when you find a villain. And when you can point to some place and say, here I know with certainty, bad things come from here and from these people, that Asians are virus carriers. They don't belong here. They don't speak English. Go back to where you came from. We've seen a rise in that in the past 4 years because that was rhetoric that was coming from the very top levels of our government. And so those sorts of the boldness of violence in the streets has increased to the point where just 2 weeks ago here in Seattle, we saw a couple that was just walking down the street and was attacked, just in broad daylight attacked. And we've seen a lot of that in the news lately. This is the inevitable wave of violence that happens every time there is some kind of economic threat or instability in our country.
I'm Danielle Kosick, and you are listening to 88.7 FM WRHU. I'm speaking with Dr. Lisa Chin about the discrimination against people of Asian descent following the pandemic. Yeah, and I know that was a very weighted question. I know we could talk about the history of discrimination against Chinese people and Asian people in America and around the world forever. I'll try to get into the pandemic now. So how did you see these kind of discriminations become disproportionately against Asians during a already hard time of being in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic?
So when the pandemic hit about a year ago, because the rhetoric was saying this is the Asian flu, this is from China, what I saw walking down the streets of walking into the International District, into the Chinatown that's here, was empty buildings, empty stores, because people were afraid that if they went into any of the stores, that they would become infected with this new SARS-type virus, that anybody who looks like me or anybody who looked Asian was potentially an infector, a carrier of viruses. So the economic impact on communities, on Asian communities, was severe, to the point where our grocery stores and any businesses that had Asians as proprietors, the businesses dried up and we started to see closures. I started to get a lot of different emails in the first, over the past year, certainly the beginning of the pandemic, saying, please patronize this business, they're going to go out of business. And often when you see a restaurant or you see something where the proprietors are Asian, it's usually a collective effort. It's usually a family or a group of families who are pooling their money and their labor together. Because when you look at the labor options for language minorities or for recent immigrants, the labor options are limited. And that's why you see a lot of people starting restaurants, because that's a place where you can make a living out of something that you know without having to have a doctorate per se, or without having to have specialized education and things. And so the businesses started to close. The need for services, for mental health services, for support started to rise. The incidences of violence, at first casual, things like racial epithets, spitting on people in the street, cars terrorizing people, driving through the streets, screaming racial slurs. The increase in prevalence out in the more rural areas of what we call sundown towns, where it's not safe for you to be there when the sun goes down. Those levels of racism started to rise, even amongst people who are self-titled liberals, white liberals, would say things to me like, well, it's a shame, but maybe they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, there was a collective level of discounting that these acts of violence could be anything but hate crimes against people. There was a whole lot of questioning about what did the victims do to invite this kind of thing on them, or maybe those stores weren't good stores in the first place, and they should open up someplace else. Maybe their prices were too high. There's a whole lot of denial around the racist roots of these actions that have really hurt the community.
And you mentioned this briefly, but so do you think that former President Donald Trump's statements about the China virus and the Wuhan flu added to this discrimination and made people think it was okay to discriminate in this way?
Yes, it absolutely did that, because he didn't call it discrimination. He pointed a finger and said, this is a China virus. Ergo, anybody who looks Chinese, because if you were to see me on the street, you couldn't tell. You couldn't tell if I was born here, if I was born someplace else. I don't have the same privilege as a white person who people assume was born here and therefore belongs in this country. So for him to say this is the China virus then means that anybody who a person thinks is from China, looks Chinese, may have had contact with a Chinese person, therefore has the potential to carry a disease, is not a human being, but is merely a vehicle for a disease that will kill people. So the dehumanization was really sanctioned at the highest levels of our government. So it's not just the violence, it's also the economy. Like, oh my goodness, if these people are carriers of this horrible disease, we can't go anywhere near them, because now they're a danger and a threat to my life. And therefore, and our president said that. So therefore it must be true.
And then I think you have answered this, but there has been discrimination, not just solely based on people being Chinese, but just any possible Asian descent.
Yes, that's
correct.
True. Because nobody can actually tell by looking at somebody, where are your ancestors from? How do you identify? Nobody knows. So it's just a blanket, my gosh, you look this way. And even, recently there have been, even after all of this, there's been a lot of coverage in the press on the rise in Asian American Pacific Islander directed violence. People, teachers, other people are still perpetuating the stereotypes of otherness. And the other day there was an example of a teacher who pulled at her eyes to illustrate how you can tell if somebody is of Chinese or Japanese heritage. And this was reported, and the school district did not fire this person. They disciplined them, but did not fire them. So it's still here.
I'm Danielle Kosick for WRHU, and you're listening to the CEO of Treehouse, Dr. Lisa Chin, discuss the violence and discrimination Asian Americans have been receiving since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Yeah, and especially with all of these hard times going on just for people in general, how do you think that this discrimination is adding not only to the struggle of Asian Americans' lives during a pandemic, but now that discrimination on top of it, making it even harder for them?
I think you said it pretty well, Danielle. It does make it harder. When I talk to my friends whose grandparents were interred because of the executive order, you never forget, because walking around the city of Seattle, people can point to buildings and say, that was in my family. This land on Bainbridge Island was in my family. And it belongs to someone else now, because when they were interred, they lost everything. So this history is very much alive, because my Japanese friends tell me, do not forget, because we had the farms, we were merchants. We were respected. We were part of this community. And then one day we were prisoners. We were no longer American. And do not forget that that can happen with an executive order, with a presidential decree, with words that are spoken from the White House. That can happen again. And we are feeling that. We are still feeling that. There was no executive order that rounded up people who looked like me and threw us into jails and camps. But what's almost as bad is throttling our businesses, beating our elders just for walking around, allowing teachers to teach young people that it's okay to pull on your eyes and to call somebody yellow. what we're seeing right now that is a form of institutionalized racism that is no less shocking than an executive order that imprisons American citizens. It's just gone bigger into the system and it's gone more subtle. Because how can we, as in this big country that we have, if something is happening in Minnesota, is someone in San Diego going to know about it or want to talk about it unless it hits the media and unless somebody somewhere doesn't let it disappear? So in all of the systems that we have, these beliefs that people in power have had about Asians are being put into laws and put into systems, and it's being perpetuated.
Do you think that had our former president denounced these actions and denounced these discriminations, we could have gone down an entirely different path?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the rhetoric was kept alive for a very long time. If there was a message similar to what we're hearing now that was coming out of Washington, D.C., that says, I care about all Americans, care about all citizens, and therefore focus on these policies, focus on what I'm doing around vaccinating people, focus on public health, focus on the economy, focus on jobs, not focus on a section of people who look like this are bad, it would have changed things for this community. And we had someone saying, these are good people, they are Americans just like you. Had we had a president go into a Chinese restaurant before everything locked down, it would have changed things. It would have shown that at the highest levels of power, Asian Americans are being respected and treated as human beings, but we had the opposite.
So then how can those of us who are allies that are not of Asian descent, that are not policymakers, how can we stand together as allies to stop the discrimination?
Patronize your local Asian businesses. Go there. Be conscious about how you use your wallet for power. Be conscious about when you learn about the history, talk about it openly. Don't expect your Asian allies to educate you. Don't ask them for that. If they volunteer it, accept it, but do not ask them. We have a lot of stuff that's available on that's public domain on the internet. People can learn about all these things. But more importantly, show up. Show up at the businesses, show up at the schools. When you see something like a teacher saying something and you are outraged or upset, please say it. Because too often people who are affected by racist violence are silent. Because if you speak up, there's a non-trivial chance you'll be killed, depending on where you'll be murdered, depending on where you are. And it is a very hard burden. And when we know that our allies are standing with us, we're less afraid. We know that we can take a walk with someone who won't allow someone to run out and, scream something, that they won't allow it. If you feel something, if you feel outrage, if you have a skill like you do, Danielle, and a platform, please use it. Because if it's not Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, it's another group. It's whoever is being perceived as a threat or who our government or anybody else in positions of authority is saying is less than you. So if it's not Asian Americans, it's going to be a different group tomorrow. And that's why it's very important to stand up to these things that affect all of us, because in the 60s, it was women. It was women don't have the right to work and women don't have the right to regulate their own bodies. We've made some progress. It's Asian Americans. What will be the next group?
Dr. Chin, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to add today?
I'd really like to thank you, Danielle, for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here today to speak with me.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to Dr. Lisa Chin for discussing this issue with us. This is Danielle Kosick for WRHU.